The Morrison for Governor campaign headquarters buzzed with excitement on the evening of November 3, 1978, just hours before Election Day. 8 dedicated volunteers worked late into the night, stuffing envelopes and making final phone calls to voters. Campaign manager Sarah Chen checked her watch, 11:47 p.m., and smiled at the team's dedication. By morning, the coffee was still warm, the phones were ringing unanswered, and all 8 volunteers had vanished without a trace. For 25 years, it remained a political mystery, until a dying security guard's confession revealed the horrifying truth about what really happened that night. Welcome to Hidden Legends. Before we begin this powerful story of courage, betrayal, and forgotten heroism, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. Now, let's uncover the dark secrets behind one of America's most shocking political disappearances. The autumn air was crisp in Columbus, Ohio, as the 1978 gubernatorial race entered its final hours. Inside the Morrison for Governor campaign headquarters, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of downtown, 8 young volunteers worked with the fervor of true believers. They had dedicated months of their lives to this moment, convinced that David Morrison would bring honest leadership to a state plagued by corruption scandals. Sarah Chen, the 28-year-old campaign manager, moved between the desks with practiced efficiency. A Harvard law graduate who had given up a lucrative job to work in politics, Sarah believed in Morrison's message of reform and transparency. Around her, the dedicated core of volunteers prepared for what they hoped would be a victory celebration. Jennifer Hayes, 24, sorted voter registration forms with meticulous care. A recent graduate from Ohio State, she had joined the campaign as an intern and quickly become indispensable. Michael Torres, 29, worked the phones with the smooth confidence that had made him one of the city's rising young lawyers. Lisa Warren, 26, a journalism major, handled press releases and media coordination. The others, David Kim, 23, Robert Martinez, 31, Susan Phillips, 27, and Thomas Anderson, 25, formed the backbone of Morrison's grassroots operation. They were teachers, social workers, and graduate students who believed they were part of something historic. As the clock approached midnight, the energy in the room was electric. Tomorrow, David Morrison would face incumbent Governor William Hartley in what polls predicted would be the closest race in Ohio history. "Just a few more hours," Sarah called out, her voice carrying over the sound of ringing phones and shuffling papers. "By tomorrow night, we'll have helped elect the most honest governor this state has ever seen." None of them could have imagined that these would be among the last words any of them would ever speak. Frank Martinez had been working security for political campaigns since 1965. A former Columbus police officer, he had seen it all: victory parties that turned into riots, candidates who celebrated too early, and staff members who worked themselves into exhaustion. But nothing in his 13 years of experience had prepared him for what he would witness on the night of November 3, 1978. His first rounds that evening had been routine. At 10:30 p.m., the Morrison headquarters was bustling with activity. Volunteers answered phones, organized materials, and discussed strategy for Election Day. Everything seemed normal, even energetic. When Frank returned at 11:30 p.m., the atmosphere had changed. The volunteers were still working, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Sarah Chen seemed agitated, speaking in hushed tones with Michael Torres near the filing cabinets. Jennifer Hayes kept glancing toward the back office where David Morrison occasionally held private meetings. Frank made a mental note but didn't think much of it. Election Eve tensions were common in his experience. At 12:45 a.m., Frank was making his routine check when he noticed 3 black sedans pulling up outside the building. This was unusual. The campaign had been expecting no late-night visitors, and these cars looked official, government-issued. Frank watched from the window as 8 men in dark suits emerged from the vehicles. The leader, a tall man with silver hair, approached the front entrance. Frank recognized him immediately. William Hartley, Jr., son of the incumbent governor and head of the state's political machine. What was he doing here at Morrison headquarters after midnight? Frank's instincts told him to stay hidden and observe. These men weren't here for a friendly political discussion. Inside the headquarters, Sarah Chen felt her heart racing as the men entered the building. She had been expecting this visit, though not so late at night. 2 hours earlier, she had made the discovery that would change everything, and ultimately cost 8 people their lives. While organizing files for tomorrow's Election Day operations, Sarah had accidentally knocked over a locked filing cabinet, causing it to open. Inside, she found documents that shouldn't have existed. Bank statements showing massive transfers from offshore accounts, photographs of Morrison meeting with known organized crime figures, and detailed records of bribes paid to state officials. David Morrison, the reform candidate who had built his campaign on fighting corruption, was himself deeply connected to the very criminal networks he claimed to oppose. Sarah had immediately called the other volunteers together. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. Morrison had been taking money from casino interests, construction companies with mob ties, and drug trafficking organizations. The Clean Government campaign was a front for the most corrupt political operation in Ohio history. The 8 volunteers faced an impossible choice: expose their candidate and destroy their own political careers, or remain silent and become complicit in a massive deception. They chose conscience over self-preservation. Michael Torres, with his legal background, suggested they contact the FBI immediately. Jennifer Hayes wanted to call the newspapers. Lisa Warren proposed taking the evidence to Morrison directly and demanding an explanation. But they would never get the chance. As they debated their next move, the front door opened and William Hartley, Jr. entered with his associates. The volunteers froze as they realized they had stumbled into something far more dangerous than political corruption. "Good evening," Hartley said, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to absolute power. "I believe you found something that belongs to us." Dr. Patricia Williams was reviewing patient files in her private psychiatric practice when the call came at 2:30 a.m. As one of the state's leading experts in memory suppression and psychological conditioning, she was occasionally contacted for special consulting work by government agencies. "Doctor, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention," the voice said. She recognized it as belonging to Colonel James Harrison, her contact within the state's political apparatus. "What kind of situation?" Dr. Williams asked, though she suspected she already knew. 8 individuals have gained access to classified information. They need to be redirected. Dr. Williams had worked on similar cases before, people who had seen too much, known too much, threatened too much. The protocols were well established, though she had never before been asked to handle so many subjects simultaneously. "Are they cooperative?" she asked. "They will be," Harrison replied grimly. An hour later, Dr. Williams arrived at a nondescript building on the outskirts of Columbus. It was one of several facilities the state maintained for special operations, places that didn't appear on any official records or budget documents. Inside, she found the 8 Morrison volunteers sedated and restrained. They had been transported here after what official reports would describe as a gas leak at campaign headquarters, a story that would explain their disorientation and memory problems. But Dr. Williams knew the truth. These young idealists had been drugged with experimental compounds designed to induce amnesia and psychological conditioning. Her job was to ensure they never remembered what they had discovered about David Morrison's criminal connections. "How long do we have?" she asked Colonel Harrison. "Morrison will win the election tomorrow," Harrison replied. "By Wednesday, this will all be forgotten. The subjects just need to disappear quietly." Dr. Williams nodded, though a part of her recoiled at what she was being asked to do. These weren't enemy agents or criminals. They were innocent young people whose only crime was believing in honesty and transparency. But she had worked for the system too long to develop a conscience now. Election Day. 1978 dawned bright and clear across Ohio. David Morrison voted early at his local polling station, surrounded by cameras and smiling for photographs. When reporters asked about his missing campaign staff, he expressed concern but suggested they had probably gone home exhausted after working through the night. "These young people have given everything to this campaign," Morrison said with practiced sincerity. "I'm sure they're just catching up on some well-deserved sleep." The families of the missing volunteers weren't satisfied with this explanation. Sarah Chen's parents contacted the police when she failed to return home or answer her phone. Michael Torres's wife grew frantic when he missed an important court appearance. One by one, the families realized something was terribly wrong. But their concerns were met with bureaucratic indifference. The Columbus Police Department launched a perfunctory investigation, interviewing the remaining campaign staff and checking the volunteers' homes. The official report concluded that the 8 had probably left town in disappointment over Morrison's expected loss. Morrison won the election by a narrow margin, and within days, the story of the missing volunteers had disappeared from the headlines. Frank Martinez, the security guard, tried to tell investigators about the late-night visit from Hartley and his associates, but his statements were dismissed as the confused recollections of an elderly man working too many hours. For 25 years, the truth remained buried. On a gray February morning in 2003, Frank Martinez lay dying in Columbus General Hospital. At 78, the former security guard had lived with the weight of his secret for a quarter century. But as his strength faded, his conscience demanded one final act of courage. He called his nephew, Detective Robert Martinez of the Columbus Police Department, to his bedside. "Bobby," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible, "I need to tell you something I should have said 25 years ago." Frank's story spilled out in painful detail. The mysterious late-night visitors, the black sedans, the volunteers who had simply vanished. He described seeing William Hartley Jr. enter the Morrison headquarters and the convoy of vehicles that left hours later. "They didn't just disappear, Bobby," Frank said, gripping his nephew's hand. "They were taken." And I was too scared to speak up. Detective Martinez felt his blood run cold. He had been a rookie patrol officer in 1978 and remembered the missing volunteers case. It had always bothered him that 8 people could simply vanish without a trace. "Uncle Frank, are you sure about this?" Frank nodded weakly. "I kept notes, Bobby. Hidden in my basement all these years. Names, license plate numbers, times. I was going to take it to my grave, but those kids deserve justice." That afternoon, Detective Martinez retrieved his uncle's hidden files. The documentation was meticulous. Photographs of the mysterious visitors, vehicle descriptions, detailed timelines. Most importantly, Frank had recorded several license plate numbers that traced back to state government vehicles. The investigation that followed would shatter Ohio's political establishment. Dr. Patricia Williams was 71 and living in quiet retirement when FBI agents knocked on her door in April 2003. The woman who had once been one of the state's most feared psychological experts now spent her days tending to her garden and trying to forget the darker chapters of her career. But the past had finally caught up with her. "Dr. Williams," Agent Jennifer Ross said, displaying her credentials, "we need to discuss your work with certain state agencies between 1978 and 1985. The doctor's face paled. She had been expecting this visit for years, ever since the first news reports about the missing Morrison volunteers had resurfaced. In her living room, surrounded by family photographs and medical awards, Dr. Williams made the decision that would bring closure to one of Ohio's most notorious mysteries. "I want to make a full confession," she said quietly. "Those 8 young people, they didn't deserve what happened to them." Dr. Williams revealed the horrific details of the cover-up operation. The volunteers had been transported to a secret facility where they were subjected to experimental psychological procedures designed to erase their memories. When the memory suppression techniques failed to completely eliminate their knowledge of Morrison's criminal connections, a more permanent solution was implemented. They were terminated one by one over a period of weeks, Dr. Williams testified, tears streaming down her face. Their deaths were made to look like accidents or suicides. Sarah Chen was found in her car at the bottom of a ravine. They said she fell asleep at the wheel. Michael Torres supposedly committed suicide in his hotel room during a business trip. The others met similar fates, all carefully staged. The bodies had been cremated quickly, before families could request independent autopsies. The cremated remains were scattered in remote locations, ensuring no physical evidence would ever be found. The congressional hearings that followed made national headlines throughout 2004. The Morrison volunteers case, as it became known, exposed a vast network of corruption that had operated in Ohio for decades. David Morrison, now a wealthy businessman and former governor, was arrested at his estate outside Columbus. The man who had campaigned on a platform of clean government faced charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. William Hartley, Jr., who had served as Ohio's lieutenant governor and later as a federal judge, was also indicted. Phone records and financial documents revealed the extent of the criminal network that had controlled Ohio politics for decades. The investigation uncovered the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened to expose the conspiracy. Journalists who asked too many questions had suffered mysterious accidents. Reform-minded politicians found their careers destroyed by sudden scandals. Whistleblowers had simply disappeared. The 8 Morrison volunteers were just the most tragic example of how far the conspiracy would go to protect itself. Linda Torres, Michael's widow, testified before Congress about the 25 years of lies and cover-ups that had followed her husband's death. "My husband was a good man who believed in doing the right thing," she said, her voice strong despite her grief. "He thought he was fighting corruption, but the corruption was so deep that it destroyed him and 7 other innocent people. For 25 years, I was told my husband killed himself because he couldn't handle the pressure of political life. I was made to believe that the man I loved was weak, that he abandoned his family and his principles. Now I know he died because his principles were too strong." The testimony revealed how the families had been systematically deceived and isolated. Private investigators hired by the families had been paid off or intimidated. Evidence had been destroyed or hidden. Official records had been altered to support the cover-up narrative. Sarah Chen's parents had spent their life savings trying to find the truth about their daughter's death. They had hired private detectives, offered rewards, and pleaded with law enforcement for answers. All the while, the people responsible for her murder were living comfortable lives in positions of power and authority. The forensic investigation led authorities to a remote area of state forest, where ground-penetrating radar detected multiple burial sites. The remains of 6 of the 8 volunteers were recovered, showing evidence of trauma inconsistent with their supposed cause of death. Sarah Chen's body showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head, not injuries consistent with a car accident. Michael Torres had defensive wounds on his hands, indicating he had fought his attackers. The physical evidence confirmed Dr. Williams's testimony about the systematic murder of the volunteers. David Morrison was sentenced to life in prison without parole. William Hartley, Jr. received a similar sentence. Dr. Patricia Williams, granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation, spent her remaining years working with victims' rights organizations. The scandal resulted in the resignation of dozens of state officials and led to sweeping reforms in Ohio's political system. New oversight legislation was passed to prevent similar abuses of power. Today, a memorial stands in downtown Columbus, where the Morrison campaign headquarters once operated. 8 bronze plaques bear the names and photographs of the volunteers who gave their lives for their principles: Sarah Chen, Michael Torres, Jennifer Hayes, Lisa Warren, David Kim, Robert Martinez, Susan Phillips, and Thomas Anderson. The inscription reads, "They believed in democracy and died defending it." Their sacrifice reminds us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would corrupt it for personal gain. Every November 3rd, families and supporters gather at the memorial to remember the 8 volunteers and to renew their commitment to honest government. Linda Torres, now in her 70s, still attends every year, carrying a photograph of her husband from their wedding day. Frank Martinez died peacefully in 2003, 3 months after giving his statement to investigators. His nephew, Detective Robert Martinez, spoke at the memorial dedication ceremony. "My uncle carried this secret for 25 years because he was afraid," Detective Martinez said. "But in the end, he found the courage to speak the truth." That's the lesson these 8 volunteers teach us, that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. The Morrison volunteers case became a landmark in American political history, demonstrating how quickly democratic institutions can be corrupted when citizens stop paying attention. It serves as a reminder that power without accountability inevitably leads to tyranny. The young idealists who stayed late at campaign headquarters on November 3, 1978, believed they were helping to elect an honest politician. Instead, they uncovered a conspiracy that cost them their lives, but ultimately exposed the corruption they died trying to fight. Their memory lives on as a testament to the courage required to speak truth to power, and as a warning that the greatest threats to democracy often come from within. In their honor, we must remain vigilant, question authority, and never assume that those who seek power are worthy of our trust. The 8 volunteers didn't live to see Election Day 1978, but their sacrifice helped ensure that future elections would be conducted with greater transparency and accountability. Their legacy is not just in the memorial that bears their names, but in the renewed commitment to democratic principles that their story inspired. As Sarah Chen had said on that final night, they were helping to elect the most honest governor this state has ever seen. They died discovering that honesty in politics is rare, but their deaths helped make it a little more common.